In the last video, we created the player movement and animation. In this video, let's create the enemy. Okay, now we're going to create the enemies that our player is going to have to dodge. The enemies are not going to be very complex. They're going to spawn at random edges of the screen, and then we'll choose a direction and we'll send them off in a straight line. We'll start by creating the mob scene, and then we can create instances of the scene, and that allows us to create as many enemies as we need. So let's go and create that. So we can go to scene, new scene to get to this spot, click on other node, and the one that we need is Widget Body 2D. We'll create that. Let's take a look at what Widget Body 2D is. So I'm gonna right click on the node and open the documentation. It's a 2D physics body that is moved by physics. What does that mean? So some things to note. It cannot be controlled directly. We apply some force to it, and then the engine, the Godot engine, is going to simulate the physics. So all we need to do is push it and it's gonna go flying. Some examples of what you can use Widget Body 2D for is things like a tree that you can knock over or a stack of crates. For our enemies, you can just think of them as a bunch of asteroids floating in space. Alright, that's what Widget Body 2D is. We'll rename it to mob. And then we're gonna add the animated sprite 2D and collision shape 2D, just like what we have done for the player. So I click on mob, add child, and animated sprite 2D. Hit enter, and we'll do it again. Collision shape 2D. Let's take care of the animated sprite 2D first. So with that selected, we'll go to the inspector, go down to animation, in sprite frames, new sprite frame, and then click on it. And then this animation panel pops up here. Let me scroll down. So what it wants us to do is create 3 animation: fly, swim, and walk. I'll just double click on the default, make it fly, expand my art, select the 2 for fly, drop it in, and I'll do the same for walk, and then swim. So we can adjust the animation speed right here under frames per second. We can set it to 3. I'll do that for each one of them. And we can preview the animation by going to the 2D panel. Let me center it by clicking on this button here. And then I'll click on the play animation button down here. Okay. So we can select the other animations. Okay, the images are a bit too big, so we want to scale it down by 0.75. So under animated sprite 2D, transform, scale, make it 0.75. Now we'll add the collision shape. Click on collision in the inspector, under shape. We're going to add a new capsule shape, and I will zoom in. I'll use the middle button to move the scene. Our enemy is facing horizontal, so we're going to rotate the capsule by going to transform and change the rotation to 90 degrees. And then I will just grab these red dots, and try to make a shape that covers the enemy. And this is good. Now let's save the scene while we're here. I'm hitting Ctrl S. I'm gonna make a new folder. I'll call it enemy, and we'll save the mob scene under enemy. Okay, we're here. Okay, going back. A Widget Body 2D object automatically responds to gravity. Let me show you what happens. Let me zoom out. I'm going to move this guy to the middle, but before I do that, I'm going to select the top node and make sure I group everything. That way, if I move one of these child nodes, it moves the whole thing. Now let me move it here, and then I'll click on play current scene, and you should see that it's gonna drop because of gravity. With the mob selected under gravity scale, we can change it to 0. That way it won't react to gravity. And then reset the scene, and now it's not gonna fall off the screen. Okay, let's talk about collision layers and mask. Still with the mob selected. Over here on collision object 2D, expand collision. Layer is a way to group objects. So here we're saying this enemy and any enemies that we spawned is going to be grouped in layer 1. We can group them in as many groups as we want. The mask says that anything in group 1 can collide with anything that we select on the mask. So right now, the enemies in group 1 can collide with other enemies in group 1. So we want to deselect it to say that the enemies will not collide with anything. Now how do we do collision detection then? Let's open the player. Let's see, the player is in group 1, same as the enemy, and it can collide with anything else in group 1. So the player can collide with the enemies doesn't collide with anything. So the collision detection code is in the player code. Right here in the last video is what we set up. On body entered. On body enter is fired when another object intersects with our player. So this is where the collision detection code is. Okay, now it's time to attach a enemy script to our object. Let me open the mob again. With mob selected, I'm attaching a new script, mob.gd, create. It's created here, and it's attached to our mob right here. When the enemy is first created, we want to play a random animation. Let me grab this code and then we'll walk through it in the ready function. So we're using the $sign notation here to reference the animated sprite 2D object, and then we call the sprite frames property. I'm going to hold down the control key and then click on animated sprite 2D to bring up the documentation. You see the documentation popped up over here, and the property that it's referencing is the sprite frames, and we can click into sprite frames to see what it is. The sprite frames contains the animations. And then it's going to call get animation names. I'm going to copy that. Okay, back at the documentation, I'm going to click on sprite frames. What we can do is hit Control F and now paste in get animation names, and it finds get animation names here. I'll click on it and it returns an array containing names associated with each animation. So what we can expect is something like this. It's gonna return fly, swim, and walk. So we know we want to play one of the animations. Let's see what's happening in here. Let me bring up my pen. Mob types .size is talking about the size of this array. So this is going to return 3. Rand I is a random integer, so it's going to generate a random integer, and then mod 3. So let me give an example. Let's say we get a random integer of 100, and then mod 3. Going back to elementary school math, 100 divided by 3. This is 9, 10, 9, 1. 100 mod 3 is the remainder, and then we're using the remainder to index into the mob type, which is 0 index, 1 and 2. And in this example, swim is the random animation that gets played. Okay, now the last thing is the on-screen notifier. This one, let's add that. Right click on mob node, add child node, on-screen notifier. What we want to do is delete the enemy when it leaves the screen. So let's go to the documentation for OnScreen Notifier. It's a rectangle space that detects whether it's on the screen or not. And it can generate 2 signals or emit 2 signals when it enters the screen and when it exits the screen. With this node selected, let's go to our 2D panel. Let me zoom in. This is the rectangle that the documentation is talking about. So when this rectangle that's attached to the enemy exits the screen, we'll get a signal. Let's handle that signal. With the node selected, go over to the node tab. The signal that we want is screen exited. Okay, double click on it. It's going to create this function for us. Click on connect, and it added the function in our mob.gd file. Let me copy this one over. Queue free. I'm gonna do control click again. Queue free queued this node to be deleted at the end of the frame. That's what we want. When the enemy exits the screen, it's gonna get deleted. Okay, so that's the end of creating the enemy section. In the next video, we'll create the main game. The main game scene is going to control the overall flow of the game. So this is where it spawns the enemies and sends them off in a certain direction. It also handles creating a new game and resetting the game. All right, I'll see you in the next video.